that in the immediate aftermath of January 6th, members of the president's family, White House staff, and others tried to step in to stabilize the situation, quote, to land the plane before the presidential transition on January 20th. You will hear about members of the Trump cabinet discussing the possibility of invoking the 25th Amendment and replacing the President of the United States. Multiple members of President Trump's own cabinet resigned immediately after January 6th. One member of the cabinet suggested that the remaining cabinet officers needed to take a more active role in running the White House and the administration.
Okay, so buckle up, because what I'm about to tell you is absolutely unprecedented in modern American history, and the ramifications are still unfolding as we speak. The Supreme Court just handed down a ruling so devastating to Trump's claims of presidential authority that it's triggered a full-blown crisis inside his own cabinet. We're not talking about some minor internal disagreement or typical Washington drama here. We're talking about high-ranking cabinet officials actively coordinating with the Senate to invoke constitutional emergency procedures, while advisors are literally abandoning ship in real time. This is the kind of political earthquake that historians will be studying and writing about for generations, because it represents a convergence of constitutional crisis, institutional breakdown, and political collapse, all happening simultaneously. The Supreme Court rejected Trump's emergency appeal and refused to uphold his sweeping claims to what he described as unlimited executive authority, and the immediate aftermath has been nothing short of chaotic. Legal analysts who've been covering the court for decades say the justices showed little sympathy for Trump's arguments about unchecked federal power, and that lack of sympathy has now cascaded into what experts are calling the most dramatic political crisis since Watergate. Multiple cabinet members have reportedly broken ranks in spectacular fashion, leaking damaging evidence to Congress and actively working with senators to explore invoking the 25th Amendment based on what they're describing as erratic and dangerous conduct, along with unlawful orders coming from the Oval Office. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Hey, Brian, well, we were waiting to see how federal courts would rule today on the Trump administration deciding to not be funding the SNAP program on November 1st. We now actually have two different judges making two different rulings. Let's start with the one in Rhode Island. That judge basically ruled from the bench, telling the U.S. government that they need to find funding for that SNAP program. They mentioned the contingency fund. This is the one that Brooke Rollins, Ag Secretary, just told us a little bit ago they couldn't use. Now a federal judge is saying you need to go ahead and use that. A Massachusetts judge, on the other hand, also seems to be leaning in the direction that the government will need to provide SNAP benefits somehow, that they cannot cut off the program. But they're saying that they need the White House to actually put in writing that they plan to not continue to fund that program, or that they're not planning on finding a backup source of funding.
Let me paint you a picture of just how rapidly this situation deteriorated, because the timeline here is absolutely crucial to understanding the magnitude of what's happening. The Supreme Court ruling came down, and within hours, not days or weeks, but literally hours, reports started emerging about cabinet-level meetings where officials were discussing their concerns about Trump's response to the legal defeat. We're talking about secretaries and senior advisors who owe their positions to Trump, people who've defended him through countless controversies, suddenly reaching a breaking point where they felt compelled to take extraordinary action. The specific trigger appears to have been Trump's immediate reaction to the Supreme Court ruling, which multiple sources describe as going beyond normal presidential frustration into territory that alarmed even his most loyal appointees. According to reports coming out of these meetings, Trump allegedly began issuing directives that cabinet members believed directly contradicted the Supreme Court's ruling and would have constituted contempt of court if implemented. When some officials raised concerns about the legality of these directives, they were reportedly met with dismissals of the court's authority and insistence that the president has powers beyond what any court can limit. That's when the situation went from tense disagreement to full-blown constitutional crisis. because cabinet members found themselves facing a choice between following presidential orders they believed were unlawful or taking the unprecedented step of working against their own president to prevent what they saw as constitutional catastrophe. The Supreme Court ruling itself is remarkably broad in scope and strikes at the very foundation of Trump's governing strategy for his entire second term. The justices didn't just rule against Trump on one specific issue. They systematically dismantled his legal theories about executive authority across multiple policy areas. The court explicitly stated that Trump overstepped his executive authority on tariffs, on National Guard deployment, on changes to federal benefit programs like SNAP, and on a whole range of emergency declarations he'd been using to bypass congressional approval. One ruling literally told the administration, "You don't even have the power to do what you're trying," which is about as blunt and unambiguous as Supreme Court language gets. What makes this so devastating is that Trump had built his entire second-term agenda around this expansive view of presidential power. His strategy was to use executive orders, emergency declarations, and unilateral presidential action to implement policies that he couldn't get through Congress, either because he didn't have the votes or because he didn't want to deal with the messy process of legislative negotiation and compromise. The Supreme Court just pulled the rug out from under that entire strategy and told him in no uncertain terms that he doesn't have the constitutional authority to govern that way. Everything Trump has done based on these theories of unlimited executive power is now legally questionable at best and outright unconstitutional at worst, according to the nation's highest judicial authority. Now let's talk about what's happening inside the cabinet, because this is where things get really unprecedented and frankly shocking, even to people who've been watching Trump's tumultuous presidency unfold. We're seeing reports of multiple high-profile officials, not just privately expressing concerns, but actively coordinating with members of Congress, specifically senators, to explore constitutional mechanisms for removing Trump from power before his term ends. The 25th Amendment has been mentioned repeatedly in these reports, and for those who aren't familiar, that's the constitutional provision that allows the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to declare the president unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. It was designed primarily for situations where a president is physically or mentally incapacitated, but the language is broad enough that it could theoretically apply to other circumstances where the president is deemed unfit to continue serving. The fact that cabinet members are even discussing this option tells you just how dire they believe the situation has become. These aren't people predisposed to oppose Trump or undermine his presidency. These are his own appointees who've spent years defending him and implementing his agenda. But the combination of the Supreme Court's devastating ruling and Trump's reported response to it has pushed them to a point where they feel constitutional duty requires them to act, even if it means ending the presidency they've been serving and destroying their own political careers in the process. The coordination with the Senate is particularly significant because invoking the 25th Amendment isn't something the cabinet can do alone. It requires congressional involvement as well, and the political math has to work out. If the vice president and cabinet declare the president unable to serve, the president can challenge that declaration, and then it goes to Congress for a vote. You need 2/3 of both the House and Senate to uphold the cabinet's decision and keep the president from resuming power. So the fact that cabinet members are reportedly coordinating with senators suggests they're doing the political calculus and trying to figure out if there's actually a viable path to using this constitutional mechanism. That kind of coordination between the executive and legislative branches to remove a sitting president is virtually unprecedented in American history. We came close during Watergate when it became clear Nixon would be impeached and removed, leading to his resignation. But even that didn't involve the cabinet actively working with Congress in quite this way. What we're seeing now is cabinet officials essentially functioning as whistleblowers and witnesses against their own president while simultaneously exploring constitutional procedures for ending his term in office. It's a level of internal collapse and institutional crisis that scholars of the presidency have theorized about in academic papers, but never really seen play out in practice with all the chaos and uncertainty that entails. The resignations and defections are happening in real time as this crisis unfolds, and the visual of advisors literally abandoning the administration adds to the sense of chaos and institutional breakdown that's gripping Washington. We're getting reports of senior staff members packing up their offices, of meetings being canceled because key officials simply aren't showing up anymore, of communication breakdowns where directives from the White House aren't being implemented because the people who would normally carry them out have either resigned or are refusing to act on orders they believe are unconstitutional. This creates a practical governance crisis on top of the constitutional one, because even if Trump legally remains president, he can't effectively govern if his own cabinet and staff won't follow his directives. The executive branch is essentially fragmenting before our eyes, with some officials still loyal to Trump and trying to carry out his wishes, while others are actively working against him and coordinating with Congress to explore removal mechanisms. That kind of division within an administration makes it nearly impossible to conduct coherent policy or respond effectively to crises that require coordinated government action. Foreign governments are watching this and wondering who's actually in charge and whether any commitments made by the administration will actually be honored or implemented. We need to examine the Supreme Court's actual rulings in detail, because the legal reasoning here is absolutely critical to understanding why this represents such a fundamental constraint on presidential power going forward and why it's triggered such an explosive response. The justices didn't just issue narrow rulings on technical points of law that lawyers could argue about in academic journals. They engaged with the underlying constitutional theories that Trump's legal team has been advancing and systematically rejected them across multiple policy areas in language so strong and unambiguous that it leaves no room for creative interpretation. Let's start with the tariff issue, because that's one of the most economically significant areas where Trump claimed sweeping unilateral authority to reshape American trade policy without congressional input. Trump had been using national security justifications to impose tariffs on various countries and products, arguing that the president has inherent authority to regulate international trade when national security is at stake. His administration cited old statutes that give the president some emergency economic powers and argued for an expansive interpretation that would essentially let him reshape American trade relationships through executive action alone without having to go through Congress for approval. The Supreme Court looked at that argument and said no. While the president has some limited authority in trade matters, the sweeping use Trump was making of national security justifications to impose tariffs without meaningful congressional input exceeds constitutional bounds and violates the separation of powers. The power to regulate commerce is explicitly granted to Congress in the Constitution, and the court ruled that executive power in this area must be exercised within clear statutory limits and can't simply override congressional authority through broad claims of emergency or national security. The National Guard deployment issue represents another major area where the court delivered a devastating rebuke to Trump's claims of unlimited executive authority as commander-in-chief. Trump had been deploying National Guard units for various purposes using emergency declarations and commander-in-chief powers as justification without seeking proper congressional authorization for domestic deployments. The administration argued that the president's role as commander-in-chief gives him essentially unlimited authority to deploy military forces. However, he sees fit to address what he determines are national security threats or domestic emergencies. The Supreme Court rejected that maximalist interpretation in the strongest possible terms and ruled that deploying National Guard units domestically for law enforcement or other civilian purposes requires proper authorization and can't simply be justified through broad invocations of emergency powers or national security concerns. The ruling draws important distinctions between the president's authority to deploy military forces in response to actual armed conflicts or foreign invasions versus using those forces for domestic policy purposes that aren't genuinely military in nature and should be handled through civilian law enforcement agencies. This matters enormously because it prevents future presidents from using military deployments as a tool for implementing domestic policy agendas that couldn't be achieved through normal political processes or congressional approval. The founders were deeply concerned about military power being used against civilian populations, which is why they built in checks on the president's authority as commander-in-chief even during emergencies. The SNAP benefits ruling deals with Trump's attempts to modify federal assistance programs through executive action, rather than going through Congress to change the laws that govern those programs and determine eligibility criteria. Trump had issued directives that would have substantially altered eligibility requirements and benefit levels for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, arguing that the president has authority to administer these programs, and that administration includes making policy changes about who qualifies and what they receive. The Supreme Court said that's not how the constitutional system works. Congress passes laws that create these programs and set the parameters for how they operate. And the president's role is to faithfully execute those laws as written, not to rewrite them through administrative action or creative interpretation. The court's ruling emphasizes the distinction between legitimate executive discretion in implementing laws versus using that discretion as a pretext for making major policy changes that should come through legislation and congressional approval. This principle extends far beyond just SNAP to virtually every federal program where Trump had been claiming authority to make sweeping changes without going back to Congress for new statutory authorization. What's particularly devastating for Trump is the cumulative effect of these rulings across multiple policy domains because it reveals a pattern rather than isolated instances of overreach. If the court had ruled against him on just one issue, his legal team could have tried to limit the damage by arguing that was a specific case with unique circumstances that doesn't affect the president's authority in other areas. But the court ruled against him on tariffs and military deployment and benefit programs and emergency declarations. Essentially, the entire toolkit Trump had been using to exercise expanded executive power without congressional approval. The pattern that emerges from these multiple rulings is a Supreme Court that's deeply skeptical of Trump's constitutional theories about presidential authority and willing to impose meaningful constraints, even though this court has a solid conservative majority, including 3 justices Trump himself appointed. The justices are essentially saying that whatever ideological sympathies they might have for Trump's policy goals, the constitutional structure of limited and separated powers is more important than achieving any particular policy outcome through unconstitutional means. That's a huge deal because it means this isn't about politics or ideology. It's about fundamental constitutional principles that transcend partisan considerations and must be respected regardless of who's in office or what policies they're trying to implement. Now, we need to talk seriously about what happens next and why this moment represents such a critical test of American constitutional democracy that will determine how our system functions for generations to come. The 25th Amendment discussions happening in the cabinet represent truly unprecedented territory that tests constitutional mechanisms in ways the founders never fully anticipated when they designed our system of government. The amendment was ratified in 1967, primarily in response to concerns about what happens if a president becomes physically or mentally incapacitated but doesn't resign or die in office. Section 4 allows the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to declare the president unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office, at which point the vice president immediately becomes acting president. But the president can challenge that declaration, and then Congress has to vote with 2/3 of both houses needed to uphold the cabinet's determination. The question scholars are grappling with now is whether this mechanism can or should be used when the issue isn't medical incapacity, but rather a president who's acting in ways that cabinet members believe are dangerously unconstitutional and threatening to the republic itself. The political dynamics of invoking the 25th Amendment are extraordinarily complex and fraught with danger for everyone involved in ways that make it an almost impossible decision to actually execute. Cabinet members who participate in such a declaration are essentially ending their own political careers and likely facing intense backlash from Trump's base supporters who will view this as betrayal and a coup attempt, regardless of the constitutional justification. The vice president would be in an especially difficult position because he would become acting president through this process, which will inevitably be characterized by Trump's defenders as a power grab, even if it's entirely constitutional and justified by Trump's conduct. Even senators who might vote to uphold the cabinet's determination would face enormous political pressure and accusations of overturning the will of voters who elected Trump to a second term. The whole process would be incredibly polarizing and could further damage public faith in institutions if a large portion of the population believes this is illegitimate political maneuvering rather than necessary constitutional action. On the other hand, if cabinet members genuinely believe Trump is acting in ways that endanger the Constitution and they don't act, they could be accused of failing in their own constitutional duties by enabling unconstitutional conduct that threatens the republic. The coordination between cabinet members and senators that's being reported suggests there are serious behind-the-scenes conversations about whether there's actually a viable path to making this work politically, even if it's justified constitutionally. The political math is crucial. Do enough senators from both parties believe the situation is dire enough to vote for upholding a cabinet declaration of presidential incapacity? Trump's support among Republican senators has been solid through many controversies, But the combination of Supreme Court rebukes and cabinet defections might represent a tipping point where even some loyal Republicans conclude that Trump has crossed too many constitutional lines to be allowed to continue. Democrats would almost certainly support upholding such a declaration, but they don't have anywhere near the two-thirds needed on their own in either chamber. It would require a substantial number of Republicans breaking ranks, which seems unlikely, but perhaps not impossible, given the extraordinary circumstances and the weight of Supreme Court condemnation backing up the cabinet's concerns about Trump's fitness to continue serving. The constitutional system is being stress-tested in ways that reveal both its strengths and vulnerabilities in handling a president who rejects institutional constraints. The strength is that the system does have mechanisms for addressing a president who's acting outside constitutional bounds, impeachment, judicial review, and even the 25th Amendment in extreme cases. The founders anticipated the possibility of a president who needed to be constrained or removed and built in tools for doing so without requiring violent revolution or military intervention. The vulnerability is that all of these mechanisms ultimately depend on political will and institutional courage to actually use them when the moment demands it. Courts can issue rulings, but they depend on executive branch compliance to enforce their decisions, since judges have no army or police force of their own. Congress can impeach, but it requires supermajorities that are hard to achieve in polarized times when partisan loyalty often overrides constitutional duty. The cabinet can invoke the 25th Amendment, but they need congressional backing, and they're putting their own careers and reputations on the line. If political tribalism and partisan loyalty prevent these mechanisms from functioning when they're genuinely needed, then the constitutional protections they're supposed to provide become hollow promises rather than real constraints on power. The implications for American democracy extend far beyond just the immediate question of Trump's fate, because this crisis is fundamentally about whether constitutional constraints on power still function in practice or whether they're just words on paper that can be ignored by a determined president with sufficient political support. If Trump survives this crisis, despite Supreme Court rebukes, cabinet defections, and impeachment proceedings, it will send a signal that presidential power is effectively unconstrained as long as the president maintains enough political support to prevent removal through constitutional mechanisms. Future presidents would learn that they can ignore court orders, defy congressional oversight, dismiss cabinet concerns, and govern outside constitutional bounds as long as they keep their base energized and their party unified enough to block removal efforts. That would represent a fundamental transformation of American governance away from constitutional democracy towards something much closer to authoritarian rule constrained only by electoral politics and public opinion rather than by institutional checks and legal boundaries. Conversely, if the system does succeed in holding Trump accountable, whether through impeachment, the 25th Amendment, or forced compliance with court orders, it will demonstrate that the constitutional structure still has teeth and can enforce meaningful constraints even on a president who commands intense loyalty from supporters and controls a major political party. The international dimension matters enormously here because America's standing in the world and its ability to promote democratic values globally depends heavily on whether our own democracy functions as advertised when subjected to serious stress. Authoritarian leaders around the world are watching this crisis closely and using it as propaganda to argue that American democracy is no more stable or legitimate than any other system, and that talk of democratic superiority is just hollow rhetoric. If American institutions fail to hold a president accountable for defying Supreme Court orders and acting outside constitutional bounds, it undermines every lecture American diplomats give to other countries about respecting judicial independence and constitutional rule of law. The whole architecture of international democracy promotion that America has led since World War II depends on the perception that democratic institutions are stronger and more legitimate than authoritarian alternatives. This crisis is testing whether that perception matches reality, and the outcome will influence how other countries think about their own governance choices and how much weight they give to American advocacy for democratic reforms and human rights. The coming days and weeks will determine how this crisis resolves, and we're all watching history unfold in real time with genuine uncertainty about outcomes that will shape American governance for generations. Will cabinet members actually follow through on invoking the 25th Amendment, or will the political barriers prove too high to overcome? Will the Senate muster the votes needed to uphold such a declaration, or will partisan loyalty override constitutional concerns, even in the face of Supreme Court condemnation? Will Trump find ways to survive and maintain power despite everything arrayed against him, Or will the accumulated weight of judicial rebukes and internal revolt finally prove too much? These questions don't have clear answers yet, and that uncertainty is itself part of the crisis because it creates instability in governance that affects everything from economic markets to foreign policy to domestic stability. What we can say with certainty is that this represents a defining moment for American constitutional democracy, a test of whether the system designed in 1787 can still constrain concentrated power in the very different context of 21st century politics with mass media and partisan polarization. The Supreme Court has done its part by striking down Trump's claims to unchecked authority. The cabinet is doing its part by refusing to enable unconstitutional conduct. Congress must now decide whether to follow through with constitutional responsibilities. The decisions made in this crucible will echo through history for generations.